Chapter 13. In the Early Days. A Study in Contrasts. As the Nazi movement became increasingly brutal, it was difficult at times to recall that in the early days there was much which impressed the casual traveler, for there were signs of renewed vitality and even a happy sense of freedom among the youth. To those who knew where to look, there was always a hinterland of suffering and distress, but it was not always easy for the foreign traveler to discover what was happening. I remember well going over early in 1936, and on the very first day I was there, I was deeply impressed by the vivid contrast between the apparently good and harmless aspects of the Nazi movement and the sinister brutality always lurking just out of sight. When I left the hotel that morning, I found that there was a great youth rally in Berlin, and I watched the march past of thousands of boys who looked in perfect health and were singing lustily. It was a most pleasing sight, and when I remembered how many of their older brothers had just lounged at street corners with no particular aim in life and no prospect for the future, I could not help feeling that the calling forth of this energy and enthusiasm was very attractive, and might, if rightly directed, prove very valuable. Certainly that morning I felt I was witnessing nothing more than a scout rally on a grand scale, grand enough to embrace the entire youth of the country. Leaving Unter den Linden, I then took a bus to the Kurfürstendamm and began walking down some streets where there are many boarding houses and blocks of flats where Jews are allowed to live. Along these streets I met some other young people, Germans too, but Jews. They were not in procession, but walked singly or stood at the pavement's edge, utterly dejected. The streets were mainly desolate, and many shops were boarded up. I was on my way to visit an old lady, whose married children and small grandchildren were out of Germany and were friends of mine. They were deeply anxious about their old mother, who had not wanted to leave her home to come abroad with them. Now another of her sons had had to leave Germany for Palestine, and I had promised I would go along and see her and try to persuade her to come over to join her daughter as soon as possible. In fact, with me, if she could be ready in time. To my dying day I shall never forget that old lady. She was very small and gentle-looking, with lovely silver hair and blue eyes. I sat down on the sofa next to her and told her who I was. She put out a frail little hand on mine and looked at me slowly, and with a dignity and courage that would not let her break down. She said, "My dear, I am not frightened of death. I am now 80 years old, and I await death. It is the next step for me, but I am so afraid of this waiting time with so many of my family away. But please don't tell them. You see, I dare not go in the streets. One never knows what will happen in this part of the city, and sometimes I am afraid to stay in alone. My neighbors are kind, but the time is long. Yes, I'm very much afraid of the time till I die." Then her face changed, as though having drawn away the veil for a moment, she would draw it again over the tragedy of her lonely waiting time, and with a happier smile and eager interest she asked me about her son and daughter and their children. We spoke of each in turn, and she was hungry for news, and agreed that when the summer came, perhaps she would travel to them. Then she began making up little parcels of chocolates for her grandchildren. "Worth nothing," she said, "but just that they know they are from grandmother." We talked of other things, for she was a well-read woman and suffered bitterly from the denial of cultural amenities to the Jews. Even when I left, she was serene and dignified, and showed no sign of the distress that had been summoned up in her first tragic words, "I am very afraid of the waiting time." I felt stifled as I left that house and walked back to the West End and the hotel at which I was staying. I had some sandwiches and coffee in my room while I talked to an English friend who was with me, and together we set forth on one more errand, made necessary by this Nazi philosophy. When I left England a week earlier, I had been asked if I would take 5 Cook's traveling tickets to Berlin. They were given to me by a German pastor in London who wanted to get his family to England. It seemed that the only way to do this was to give them tickets from Germany to England. These were made out as return tickets, so that it should not be thought they were trying to escape from Germany, but just going over to friends for a summer holiday. I had been worried about these tickets and wanted to deliver them, but knew I must carry out my instructions carefully. "Go after 9 p.m. at night," said the pastor, "and give 3 knocks at the door. That is the sign to my wife you are a friend, and then her companion will open the door." It was not easy to find the right maisonette, especially as the pastor had asked me not to ask the way of any stranger, nor to let anyone realize I was visiting his wife, as my being a foreigner might arouse suspicion. We had therefore to leave the hotel and take a taxi to a different address, and then in the dark work our way back to the right house. The German pastor's wife was very typical. She had a direct, honest look. Her hair was drawn straight back, and she had no frills in dress, manner, or in speech. I gave her her husband's letter and the 5 tickets, and explained to her that he thought it wiser that the tickets should be made out from Leipzig, where she could go and spend a few days first with some relations, as they often did, and travel to England from there. This rather appalled poor Frau Pastor, for she had 4 small children, and had felt the journey to England would be hard enough if she left from Berlin. "Oh dear, I wonder why he did this. Doesn't he realize how difficult it is, and that I shall want to take as much luggage and to attract as little attention as I can?" We sat for an hour talking out the practical details till my head grew dizzy with all the complications involved in getting a loyal German woman with her children, who should have been a credit to any country, away as an exile, leaving her home, her elderly parents, and all her friends. As we finished discussing the details, she turned to us and said, "It all seems as if it could not be real that we should go as fugitives from the country of our birth, and which we love, and go into an unknown future with everything uncertain, and now to have to go a long roundabout journey to get there. And why? Because my husband would preach in his church the Christian gospel. He is not political, but he felt he must go on saying, especially to his younger people, that they must not worship an idol. And when in this neighborhood the father of a Jewish family was taken to prison, we looked after his family. A brutal Nazi Gestapo man struck my husband for that, and it was only because another young boy who was in the Nazi party, but is very ashamed, though he won't say so, warned my husband to leave quickly, that he got away. For the day after he crossed the frontier into Holland, the Gestapo came to arrest him." "It must seem terrible to you," she said. "I myself cannot believe it is real. I had thought of religious persecution as something of the past, and even in Russia, well, I thought the church had been political, and that they were afraid a counter-revolution might come from it. But here in Berlin, my husband is not going to lead a counter-revolution, and yet he cannot preach the gospel. It is utterly impossible. I cannot understand why they think we are worth persecuting." She drew a breath. "Perhaps I do not see deep enough, for my husband says that it is inevitable that they should persecute us, because although the church does not seem very powerful, its teaching does strike at the very root of the Nazi teaching, and that in time men must choose." "But I must not keep you, and it would not be wise for you to leave here in the middle of the night. Thank you very much for bringing the tickets." Then, just as we were leaving, she called us back and added, "Do not tell my husband that I am greatly worried about this Leipzig business, for he does not realize all the money difficulties, and he is only so anxious to have us in England without rousing suspicion. He does not fully realize that it means to escape secretly with 4 children, what it means to escape secretly with 4 children under 9 years of age. You see, the youngest is only a year old. But thank you, and I will see you in England, I hope, some day." As we walked home that night, the three scenes came back. The gay, happy, healthy young group marching down Unter den Linden with unmistakable signs of life and inspiration. The tragic little old lady, the plucky pastor's wife trying to escape secretly with 4 children. All these are the results of Nazism, and we realized then that as it was developing, it would be the gay happiness that would pass, since a movement that suffered these other things to happen carried within it the seed of death and destruction to all that is good. But even then, we could hardly have imagined to what lengths of brutality and ruthlessness the Nazis would go in Germany and throughout Europe, so that these early stories scarcely seem worth repeating, except as indicating the sure signs of a movement that was going to lead to the grim terror of Poland and occupied Europe.